She forged 3 kingdoms into one colossal superstate, defying a Europe that seemed determined to tear itself apart. He, on the other hand, watched that very superstate turn on its own people, then bravely picked up the torch of rebellion. One crown, born of audacious vision, rose in 1397. The other, fueled by righteous fury, shattered it in 1523. This, my friends, is the epic 126-year chess match between the woman who painstakingly built the Kalmar Union and the man who with a roar blew it apart. Just imagine Scandinavia today as a single, unified country. Picture it, one flag fluttering proudly from Copenhagen all the way to the Arctic Circle. One formidable navy ruling the vast strategic Baltic Sea, and one powerful monarch collecting taxes in 3 distinct languages, all at the same time. Sounds like something out of a fantasy novel, doesn't it? Well, believe it or not, that country almost existed. And for a significant period, it was masterfully run by a formidable Danish widow who, remarkably, never lost a war. Now, fast forward a century and a half. The landscape has dramatically shifted. Those same lands are now bitterly split. The tacksmen speak only Danish. And a young Swedish teenager is desperately fleeing for his life through silent, snow-covered forests, pursued by enemies who want him dead. By the time that teenager grows up and claims his rightful place as king, the Grand Union is not just fractured, it's utterly dead. Sweden stands free, and Europe has gained a brand new Protestant power, one ready to assert itself on the world stage. So, how did one extraordinary woman manage to piece the entire North together with such skill and foresight? And then, how did one determined man manage to pull it all apart again, changing the course of history forever? Our story begins with Margaret Valdemarsdatter, born in 1353. A year that saw the terrifying grip of the Black Death finally begin to loosen its hold on a devastated Europe. Her father was King Valdemar IV of Denmark, a man who, let's be honest, spent most of his turbulent reign mortgaging off castles and crown lands to eager German bankers just to keep his kingdom afloat. At the tender age of 10, Margaret was shipped off, as was the custom of the time, to wed King Håkon VI of Norway. Pure politics, right? A strategic alliance, nothing more, nothing less. But this marriage, seemingly just another political pawn move, gave her something invaluable, a son Olaf, and with him, a legitimate claim to 2 powerful crowns. Then, tragedy struck, swiftly and repeatedly. Her father and her husband both died within a dizzying 5-year span. Suddenly, a mere 14-year-old Olaf found himself king of both Denmark and Norway. And Margaret, still in her vibrant 20s, she stepped in as regent. The thing is, she never really handed the keys back. When Olaf died unexpectedly and suddenly in 1387, Margaret didn't hesitate. She simply kept ruling, boldly calling herself husband, an Old Norse term that translates roughly to master of the house. It was a title typically reserved for men, a deliberate and audacious statement of her authority. And you know what? No one dared to laugh or even question her. Her sheer force of will and political acumen commanded that much respect, or perhaps fear. She wasn't just holding the reins, she was actively governing. Margaret crushed a rampant German pirate fleet that had been plaguing the Baltic, halved the royal debt that her father had accumulated, and, with astonishing political dexterity, transformed the unruly Danish nobles from constantly feuding warlords into salaried, loyal officials of the crown. But her real stroke of genius, the move that truly cemented her legacy, came in 1388. Furious with their own inept king, a group of Swedish nobles practically begged her to advise them. Margaret, ever the pragmatist, arrived with a well-disciplined army, swiftly had the Swedish king exiled, and then, with an eye to the future, installed her young grandnephew, Eric of Pomerania, as the Union's future figurehead. He would be the face. She would be the brain. On a pivotal day, the 17th of June, 1397. In the quiet, unassuming town of Kalmar, the representatives of the three kingdoms formally signed a charter. This historic document swore that one king shall rule all the North. It was a monumental achievement. Margaret herself wore no crown at the ceremony. Eric got the shiny hat, the visible symbol of power. But everyone present, from the lowliest page to the most powerful noble, knew exactly who had truly signed that parchment last. For the next 22 years, she governed not from a gilded throne, but from behind a desk, meticulously issuing laws in Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish. Each decree bore the same distinctive thick seal, Margareta, by the grace of God, true heir of Denmark. Norway and Sweden, Europe, in awe of her accomplishments, dubbed her the Semiramis of the North. A fitting comparison to the legendary Assyrian queen credited with building the magnificent city of Babylon. Under her shrewd and steady hand, trade routes across Scandinavia reopened. Piracy plummeted to historic lows, and, for the first time since the age of the Vikings, Scandinavia spoke with a unified, powerful voice in foreign courts. She died in 1412, at the age of 15-9, aboard a merchant ship. Still actively engaged in diplomacy, on her way to negotiate yet another crucial treaty. Legend has it that her loyal sailors, determined not to let the crew lose heart during the stormy voyage home, kept her body upright in a chair. Even in death, it seems, Margaret's indomitable will insisted on waiting for diplomacy to conclude. She was a pioneering female ruler who not only shaped Scandinavian history, but also laid the groundwork for future unions and centralized royal power. Eric of Pomerania, Margaret's carefully chosen heir, certainly had ambition. But what he sorely lacked was her patience, her diplomatic finesse, and her innate understanding of power dynamics. He tried to fund his grand vision of a powerful Baltic navy by slapping exorbitant tolls on every single herring barrel passing through the Sound. A seemingly simple economic move, right? Wrong. The powerful Hanseatic League, an economic and defensive confederation of merchant guilds and market towns, retaliated with devastating blockades that effectively emptied Scandinavian harbors, choking off vital trade. This wasn't the shrewd statesmanship Margaret had practiced. Meanwhile, the Swedish nobles weren't exactly thrilled either. They grumbled incessantly that Danish castles were staffed exclusively by Danish bailiffs who spoke no Swedish, and to add insult to injury, seemed to collect steeper and steeper taxes every single year. The simmering discontent finally boiled over, and rebellion flared violently in 1434. Eric, instead of seeking reconciliation, responded with brutal, short-sighted cruelty, executing hostages in Stockholm Square. The Union, against all odds, survived that particular crisis, but only by making desperate promises to the Swedes, their own council, lower taxes. Promises that, predictably, were broken within a mere decade. For the next 80 years, a weary, predictable pattern repeated itself over and over again. A Danish king would tighten his grip, Swedish nobles would revolt, and a fragile temporary peace would be bought with new charters that absolutely nobody truly respected. Margaret's elegant, carefully constructed compromise won crown. But 3 distinct, respected councils degenerated into a bitter, endless tug-of-war. It was a struggle between the entrenched aristocrats of Copenhagen, intent on maintaining their dominance, and the fiercely independent Swedish miners, who simply wanted their own tariffs on their precious copper and iron. By the turn of the 16th century, around 1500, the Kalmar Union was, technically speaking, still intact. But in practical terms, it had fractured into 3 kingdoms merely sharing a postage stamp, a hollow shell of Margaret's grand vision. And then, into this volatile mix, stepped Christian II. He was elected King of Denmark in 1513. A man nicknamed the Good in his loyal Copenhagen, but universally reviled as the tyrant everywhere else. Christian harbored a singular, fervent dream to finally finish what Margaret had so brilliantly started. He envisioned a truly centralized North, absolutely answerable only to his royal court, with all power flowing directly from him. But standing squarely in his path was Sweden's regent, the fiercely independent Sten Sture the Younger, who blocked Christian at every single turn. After years of skirmishes and simmering animosity, Christian finally played his hand. He lured the leading Swedish nobility to Stockholm, promising them safe conduct, a guarantee of their security. On the 7th of November 1520, he rode triumphantly through the city gates, flanked by his formidable German mercenaries. He invited the unsuspecting leading nobles to a lavish 3-day feast, a deceptive display of hospitality. Then, in a chilling turn, he locked the doors. The verdict, handed down by a hastily assembled court: heresy, their crime. Some of them had supposedly supported an anti-union sermon, a flimsy pretext for Christians' true intentions. The sentence: beheading. Between the breakfast meal and the fading dusk, a horrifying 82 men lost their heads in the palace square. Their bodies were left unceremoniously for the crows, a grotesque spectacle, while Christian soldiers, oblivious to the horror, partied raucously in the blood-soaked snow. This infamous event, forever known as the Stockholm bloodbath, lasted less than a week. But its impact resonated for centuries. it didn't just mark the failure of the Union. It transformed it into something murderous, irrevocably staining its legacy. The Union hadn't merely collapsed. It had devoured its own. Among the condemned men was a powerful noble whose nephew, a sharp 19-year-old named Gustav Eriksson, miraculously escaped the city, disguised as a humble cattle drover. He fled eastward on skis, a desperate dash for survival, hiding in isolated peasant cottages, nursing a burning vow of revenge against every single Danish soldier who couldn't even pronounce his surname correctly. This wasn't just an escape. It was the birth of a legend, a symbol of Swedish defiance. Gustav Eriksson Vasa, and yes, for those curious, his name literally means sheaf of grain, was born in 1496 into a powerful, though not royal, Swedish family. His childhood was spent amidst the rugged beauty of the upland forests, where he learned not only to hunt with skill, but also to speak Latin, a mark of his noble upbringing, and to shrewdly bargain with the German miners who bought Sweden's rich iron ore. At 16, he was sent to the court of Sten Sture as a page, learning the intricacies of court life and politics. Then, at 19, he witnessed the unthinkable, the brutal execution of his own relatives in Stockholm. That moment would forever forge his destiny. For the next 2 desperate years, Gustav zigzagged across the vast, wild region of Dalecarlia, tirelessly stirring up the resilient miners and farmers. He tapped into their deep-seated resentment against the heavy Danish taxes levied on their precious copper and rye. The Danes, recognizing the growing threat he posed, put a hefty price on his head, 2,000 marks, a sum large enough to buy a small castle. Yet the loyal peasants, seeing him as a beacon of hope, hid him anyway. They affectionately called him the wood grouse, because he had an uncanny knack for vanishing into the dense spruce forests whenever Danish soldiers appeared, seemingly melting into the landscape. In January 1521, the proud Dalecarlians, inspired by his courage and vision, elected him their leader. They pledged a formidable force of 1,000 armed men, but with a practical caveat: he had to feed them. Reply was direct, audacious, and filled with strategic genius. First, we take Vasters, then we take Stockholm, then we take back our taxes. And they did. By that summer, Gustav's burgeoning rebel army had seized control of the crucial copper mines, effectively cutting off the Danish king's vital supply of coin. Christian II, now distracted by pressing troubles back home in Denmark, shipped more German mercenaries north. But these foreign soldiers arrived starving because the fiercely patriotic Swedish farmers had burned their own fields rather than sell a single grain of their harvest to the invaders. Just 1 year into the uprising, Gustav controlled a staggering 2/3 of Sweden. He had even begun coining his own silver thalers, each proudly stamped with a powerful lion crushing a Danish snake, an unmistakable declaration of independence. In June 1523, after a brutal siege that tragically reduced Stockholm's population by half, the city gates finally opened. Gustav rode triumphantly through the very same square where his relatives had been so cruelly executed. He dismounted and, reportedly, knelt to offer thanks to God. Then he rose, stood tall, and declared himself King of Sweden. The Kalmar Union, so meticulously forged by Margaret's unparalleled diplomacy and vision, died with a quiet whimper, not a bang. Christian II, his dream of a unified North shattered, fled ignominiously to the Netherlands, and no Danish fleet ever arrived to avenge him. Sweden was, at last, truly free. Margaret built her grand unity through carefully orchestrated marriage treaties, the strategic exchange of royal hostages, and the formidable power of a navy that could, at will, shut down the vital sound, Gustav. On the other hand, forged Sweden's hard-won independence through a very different, more radical approach, confiscating vast church lands, creating a national militia drawn from the common people, and, crucially, translating the Bible into Swedish so that every parish could read God's law, and by extension, the king's law, in their own mother tongue. She deftly ruled 3 kingdoms without ever needing to wear a physical crown, her authority stemming from her intellect and will. He, in a bold act of defiance, crowned himself king even before the archbishop could arrive, then, after replacing the archbishop with a staunch Lutheran, simply told the church to crown him again. Under Margaret's shrewd governance, Copenhagen grew immensely rich on the lucrative sound tolls. Under Gustav, it was Swedish iron and copper that financed a powerful new fleet, one that would one day come to dominate the entire Baltic Sea. Both monarchs, in their respective eras, faced the persistent challenge of noble revolts. Margaret, the master diplomat, typically bought them off with generous land grants and strategic alliances. Gustav, the pragmatic rebel, took a far more direct approach. He simply hanged the rebellious leaders and confiscated their vast estates, using the proceeds to fund his burgeoning navy and strengthen his new kingdom. By the time Gustav died in 1560, Sweden's tax income had miraculously tripled. The once unruly nobility now sat in a formalized riksdag, a national assembly, rather than gathering in private war councils. And the country's proud new flag, bearing the distinctive yellow cross, flew high, a symbol of a new, independent nation. A flag that still flies today. Margaret's enduring legacy is enshrined in a magnificent marble sarcophagus in Roskilde Cathedral, intricately carved with the 3 crowns of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden's poignant epitaph to a grand ambitious dream. Gustav's rests in Uppsala Cathedral, surrounded by the tombs of his powerful Vasa descendants. The dynasty he founded, who would go on to transform Sweden into a formidable European superpower, a force to be reckoned with. So, who truly won this long, drawn-out game? Margaret, without a doubt, gave Scandinavia a century of invaluable joint bargaining power against formidable external threats like the Hanseatic League and the sprawling Holy Roman Empire. Without her unifying vision, it's entirely plausible that the 3 individual kingdoms might have been picked off, one, by larger, more aggressive powers. Gustav, for his part, gave Sweden something equally profound: a distinct language, a national church. and a robust tax system strong enough to bankroll an empire that would, for a time, stretch across the entire Baltic. Today, Denmark and Sweden share a physical bridge, a mutual love of herring, and a spirited, friendly football rivalry. Thankfully, no more bloodbaths, just passport-free crossings. Yet, every time a Swedish politician playfully jokes about the Danish taxes, or a Dane boasts proudly about the Swedish model, they are, in a subtle way, replaying the very argument that began in 1397 and was so violently concluded in 1523. It's the eternal question: do we stand stronger together, or are we ultimately freer alone? Margaret and Gustav never met in person, separated by time and circumstance, but their ghost debate still echoes, a timeless whisper across the shimmering waters of the Resund. If you found yourself captivated by this royal rumble, then do me a favor. Tap that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because trust me, more Northern drama is definitely on the way. And I'd love to know what you think. Leave a comment below. Would you have backed the Unifier Queen or the Rebel King? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next chapter of history.